In the Gospel of Philip, there's a passage that theologians have argued about for decades. It describes Jesus placing his hands on the heads of his inner circle and saying, "I open the book that has been sealed, the record of everything that has been, everything that is, everything that could be. You will read from this book not with eyes, but with knowing." The early church fathers knew exactly what he was describing. They called it forbidden knowledge. They labelled it sorcery, divination, witchcraft. And they systematically removed every reference to this teaching from texts that would become the Bible. But they couldn't remove what Jesus was actually teaching: direct access to the Akashic records, the energetic library containing every thought, every action, every choice made by every consciousness that has ever existed. The Akashic records aren't a metaphor. They're not a spiritual concept. In Gnostic texts, they're described as the Book of Life, a dimensional field of information that exists outside time, accessible to anyone who knows the proper frequency to enter it. And Jesus taught a specific technique to access it. What if the knowledge you seek has always existed within you? What if remembering replaced learning long before anyone thought to write things down? Before the term Akashic records entered spiritual vocabulary in the 19th century, before Helena Blavatsky borrowed the Sanskrit word Akasha, meaning ether or sky, before the concept became associated with New Age mysticism, there existed something older, something unnamed, something that required no language to access because it preceded language itself. In the beginning, there were no books, no scrolls, no tablets. There was only memory. The ancient peoples understood this in ways we have forgotten. They did not view knowledge as something external to be acquired, catalogued, stored in libraries or temples. They understood knowledge as something remembered, something that had always been present, waiting not to be discovered but recalled. In the oral traditions of pre-literate cultures across every continent, we find the same pattern. The elder does not teach the young by transferring information. The elder creates conditions under which the young remember what they already know. The storyteller does not invent stories. The storyteller remembers them, and in the act of remembering they access something that exists independent of their individual consciousness. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the dream time, a dimension outside linear time where all events, past, present and future, exist simultaneously. They do not learn the dream time, they remember it. Their songlines are not maps drawn on paper, but pathways of memory embedded in landscape, in consciousness, in the fabric of existence itself. The Celtic Druids memorized vast bodies of knowledge, refusing to commit their wisdom to writing for reasons that went beyond secrecy or exclusivity. They understood that writing externalizes knowledge, places it outside the self, makes it object rather than essence. Memory keeps knowledge alive. Memory keeps it internal. Memory makes it inseparable from consciousness itself. In ancient India, the Vedas were transmitted orally for thousands of years before anyone wrote them down. The rishis who received these texts did not compose them. They heard them. They remembered them from a source that existed before sound, before word, before thought crystallized into language. The pattern repeats across cultures that had no contact with one another. The pattern suggests something fundamental about the nature of knowledge and consciousness. What if knowledge is not created but accessed? What if the role of the wise is not to invent wisdom but to remember it? What if there exists a field of information, a repository of all knowing, that consciousness can enter under the right conditions? This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the foundation upon which every ancient wisdom tradition was built. The ancients did not separate memory from spirituality. They understood memory as a sacred faculty, a bridge between the individual soul and universal consciousness. To remember was to participate in something vast, something that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. In the Platonic tradition, learning was understood as recollection. Plato taught that the soul, before incarnating into physical form, existed in a realm of pure forms where it knew all truth directly. Birth into the physical world caused forgetting. Education, then, was not the acquisition of new knowledge, but the remembrance of what the soul had always known. This was not philosophical speculation. This was description of a lived experience that students in the mystery schools encountered directly. Through specific practices involving fasting, meditation, ritual purification, and initiatory experiences, students reported accessing knowledge they had no way of knowing through ordinary means. They described it not as learning something new, but as remembering something forgotten. The Greek concept of anamnesis, unforgetting, points to this same understanding. Truth is not outside you, waiting to be found. Truth is inside you, waiting to be remembered. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalists speak of the soul's pre-existence in the divine realm. Before birth, the soul knows all of Torah, all of wisdom, all of truth. An angel strikes the infant on the mouth before birth, causing forgetting. The spiritual path is the journey of remembering what was known before incarnation. Why would traditions separated by geography and culture describe the same phenomenon? Why would they independently arrive at the understanding that knowledge is remembered rather than learned? Because they were describing something real, something consistent, something that exists independent of belief or cultural framework. The soul carries its own record, not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually. Every experience you have ever had exists somewhere in consciousness. Every thought, every emotion, every choice, every moment of awareness leaves an imprint, not just in the brain's neural networks, but in something deeper, something that persists beyond the dissolution of the physical body. Near-death experiences frequently report life reviews where they see every moment of their existence simultaneously. They do not watch a linear replay. They experience it all at once, from multiple perspectives, with complete understanding of how each action affected others. This is not imagination. This is consistent testimony from people across cultures who have briefly exited physical consciousness and returned. Where does this information exist? How can it be accessed so completely, so immediately, without the brain's normal filtering mechanisms? The ancient answer, consciousness is not produced by the brain. Consciousness is primary. The brain is a receiver, a filter, a reducing valve that narrows infinite awareness into the bandwidth necessary for physical survival. But consciousness itself is vast, and it has memory, perfect memory, complete memory, memory of everything that has ever occurred within it. This is why spiritual practice in every tradition involves quieting the ordinary mind, not because thinking is bad, but because thinking is local. Thinking is the activity of the individual mind filtering and interpreting experience. Memory, deep memory, soul memory, exists beneath thought, in the stillness where individual consciousness touches universal consciousness. When you quiet the thinking mind, when you drop beneath the surface chatter of daily awareness, you discover that you know things you have no reason to know. You remember things you never experienced in this life. You access information that exists independent of your personal history. This is not psychic ability. This is not supernatural gift. This is the natural function of consciousness operating without the filters that normally constrain it. But here is where the problem begins. Here is where knowledge becomes dangerous. Here is where the pattern shifts from wisdom to suppression. If truth is inside, accessible through inner faculties that every human possesses, what need is there for external authority? If you can remember truth directly, why do you need someone to tell you what is true? If you can access the record of what actually happened, why do you need an institution to mediate that knowledge for you? The moment knowledge becomes internalized, the moment access becomes direct, the moment the individual can verify truth through their own experience rather than accepting it on authority, power structures begin to crumble. In the earliest expressions of every spiritual tradition, we find teachers who function as guides rather than authorities. The Buddha did not ask for belief. He said, "Do not accept my words on faith. Test them. Verify them through your own experience." The emphasis was on direct knowing, on personal verification, on inner authority. But as traditions institutionalize, as movements become organizations, as living transmission calcifies into doctrine, something shifts. The teacher becomes the authority. The guide becomes the gatekeeper. Direct access becomes mediated access. Inner knowing becomes dangerous deviation. This is not conspiracy. This is structure. This is what happens when living wisdom becomes institutional religion. Organizations require hierarchy. Hierarchy requires gatekeeping. Gatekeeping requires controlling access to knowledge. And the most effective way to control access to knowledge is to convince people that they cannot access it directly, that they need intermediaries, that attempting to access it themselves is dangerous or forbidden or sinful. The pattern repeats across every tradition. In early Christianity, believers were encouraged to have direct encounters with the divine, to receive personal revelation, to know Christ internally. By the 4th century, councils were determining which texts were acceptable, which experiences were legitimate, which forms of knowing were orthodox and which were heretical. In early Buddhism, practitioners were encouraged to verify teachings through direct meditation experience. By the time Buddhism became state religion in various kingdoms, elaborate hierarchies determined who had authority to teach, who had attained which levels of realization, who was qualified to interpret doctrine. In early Islam, Sufis taught direct knowing of the divine through practices that bypassed scholarly interpretation. Orthodox authorities condemned them as heretics, persecuted them, executed them for claiming direct access to truth that should be mediated through proper religious authority. The pattern is consistent. Direct knowing threatens institutional power. Memory threatens official history. Inner authority threatens external control. And so began the long project of convincing humanity that what they could access directly was either impossible, dangerous, or demonic. This is the context into which Jesus emerged. This is the world he entered. This is the authority structure he threatened simply by teaching people to look within. Jesus did not build a temple. He did not establish a priesthood. He did not create systematic theology or doctrinal frameworks. He taught outside institutional structures, in fields and on hillsides, by lake shores and in homes, wherever people gathered to listen. This was not accidental. This was intentional refusal to participate in the mechanisms through which knowledge becomes controlled, access becomes restricted, and inner authority becomes replaced by external authority. The Gospels, even in their edited form, even after centuries of institutional shaping, still preserve traces of this pattern. Jesus teaching in parables that confound the learned. Jesus refusing to give direct answers when questioned by authorities. Jesus speaking in riddles and paradoxes that cannot be understood intellectually, but must be grasped through a different kind of knowing. Why do you speak to them in parables? The disciples ask. And Jesus replies with something strange. To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. This sounds exclusionary. It sounds like Jesus is deliberately withholding knowledge from the masses, but read more carefully. Read what comes next. For whoever has, to him more will be given, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away. This is not about social status or spiritual hierarchy. This is about receptivity. This is about the capacity to receive knowledge that cannot be transmitted through ordinary means. A parable is not an illustration. A parable is an activation device. It works on consciousness differently than direct instruction. It bypasses the analytical mind and plants seeds in deeper soil, seeds that germinate not through intellectual understanding, but through a kind of inner recognition. When Jesus tells a story about a sower scattering seed, he's not just describing agricultural practice, he's describing the transmission of knowledge itself. Some seed falls on hard ground and never takes root. Some falls among thorns and gets choked. Some falls on good soil and produces abundant harvest. The seed is the same. The difference is the soil. The difference is the receiver's capacity to let knowledge take root in consciousness at levels deeper than intellectual comprehension. This is why Jesus taught outside temples. Inside temples, knowledge is formalized. Inside temples, understanding becomes doctrine. Inside temples, the mysterious becomes explained, and in being explained, it loses its power to transform. Outside, in the open, with no formal structure, no hierarchy, no mediation between teacher and listener, something else becomes possible. Direct transmission, heart to heart, consciousness to consciousness, not through words but through presence. The Gnostic texts, the ones not included in the canonical Bible, preserve more of this dimension. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not have will destroy you." This is not moral instruction. This is description of a spiritual technology. Bring forth what is within you. Access the knowledge that already exists in your consciousness. If you do this, you are saved. Not in some future afterlife, but here, now, saved from ignorance, from dependence, from the need for external authority to tell you what is true. If you do not do this, If you fail to access your own inner knowing, then what you do not have, your own direct connection to truth, will destroy you. You will remain dependent. You will remain controlled. You will never know for yourself. The kingdom of God is within you. These words appear in Luke's Gospel, 5 words that, if taken seriously, completely undermine the entire structure of institutional religion. 5 words that shift the locus of spiritual authority from external to internal, from institution to individual, from mediated access to direct knowing. The Greek word translated as within is entos, which can mean either within or among. Some translations render it, the kingdom of God is among you, suggesting that the kingdom manifests in community, in relationships, in the space between people. But the Gnostic texts leave no ambiguity. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father, inside and outside, not heaven, not a future realm, not a reward for correct belief, here, now, accessible through self-knowledge. This is radical. This is revolutionary. This completely inverts the power structure of conventional religion. If the kingdom is within you, you do not need priests to grant you access. If the kingdom is within you, you do not need rituals to earn entry. If the kingdom is within you, you do not need scriptures to tell you what it looks like because you can experience it directly. But what does this mean practically? What is the kingdom that exists within? In the Gnostic understanding, the kingdom is not a place. The kingdom is a state of consciousness. It is the experience of knowing yourself not as a separate individual disconnected from source, but as an expression of the divine, as consciousness itself taking temporary form in matter. When you know yourself this way, when you experience your own consciousness as continuous with universal consciousness, you have entered the kingdom, not through death, not through achieving moral perfection, not through being selected or saved, through remembering what you actually are. And with this remembering comes something else, access. Direct access to knowledge that transcends personal experience. Direct access to truth that exists independent of belief or interpretation. Direct access to the record of all that is, all that has been, all that could be. This is what Jesus was teaching, not belief, not faith, not moral behavior as ticket to future reward. He was teaching a method, a practice, a way of shifting consciousness from identification with the separate self to recognition of universal awareness. And when you make that shift, when consciousness expands beyond personal boundaries, you discover that you can know things you have no business knowing. You can access information that exists nowhere in your personal memory. You can read the record. But who were the chosen ones? Who were the disciples, the inner circle, the ones to whom Jesus taught these mysteries directly? Later theology transformed them into special beings, divinely selected, spiritually superior to ordinary humans. The Church created hierarchies based on this idea. Some people are chosen, most are not. Some have access to divine knowledge, most must accept teaching on authority. This is precisely the opposite of what Jesus taught. In the Gnostic texts, chosen does not mean selected by external divine decree. Chosen means awakened. It means having developed the capacity to receive teaching that cannot be transmitted through ordinary means. It means having prepared consciousness to the point where direct knowing becomes possible. Anyone can become chosen. The process is not about being selected. The process is about becoming receptive. Think of a radio receiver. All the signals exist in the air around you at all times. Every radio station is broadcasting simultaneously, but your receiver only picks up the frequency to which it is tuned. To hear a different station, you do not need to be chosen by that station. You need to change your frequency. The disciples were not spiritually superior beings. They were people who had, through whatever combination of circumstances and inner work, developed the capacity to receive transmission at frequencies most people could not yet access. Jesus did not create this difference. Jesus worked with what was already present. He taught those who could hear, not because others were unworthy, but because others were not yet tuned to the right frequency. And the entire purpose of the teaching was to help more people tune to that frequency. The entire purpose was to spread this capacity, not to restrict it to an elite few. This is why Jesus taught in public. This is why he told parables that anyone could hear. This is why he healed people who had never studied spiritual practices. He was demonstrating that access was not limited. He was showing that the kingdom within was available to anyone who developed the capacity to recognize it. But capacity is not the same as entitlement. You cannot demand access to frequencies you are not prepared to receive. You cannot force consciousness to expand beyond its current bandwidth. The work is internal, the preparation is individual, the opening is personal, and this is where the teaching becomes dangerous to institutional power. Because if anyone can develop this capacity, if the chosen can become unchosen, and the unchosen can become chosen through their own effort and grace, then hierarchies lose their foundation. Then gatekeepers lose their function. Then the entire structure of mediated access collapses. The term Akashic records is modern. The Sanskrit word Akasha refers to ether, to the subtle element that pervades space, to the medium through which all phenomena arise and pass away. When Western esotericists began using this term in the late 19th century, they were attempting to name something that ancient traditions had described in different languages across different cultures. The Book of Life in Judeo-Christian mysticism, the Tablet of Destiny in Mesopotamian tradition, the world memory in Platonic philosophy, the universal mind in Hermetic teaching. Different names for the same phenomenon, a field of information that exists independent of physical storage, accessible through consciousness rather than through physical means. But here is where modern interpretations often go astray. They imagine the Akashic records as a cosmic library somewhere in another dimension. They picture infinite shelves containing books about every soul's journey. They create elaborate visualization exercises to travel to this library and consult the records. This is metaphor mistaken for mechanism. This is imagination replacing understanding. The Akashic records are not a place you travel to. The Akashic records are not separate from your own consciousness. The Akashic records are the informational structure of consciousness itself. Consciousness is not produced by brains. Brains filter and focus consciousness, allowing infinite awareness to narrow into the bandwidth necessary for physical survival and functioning. But consciousness itself is primary. Consciousness is fundamental, and consciousness has perfect memory, not memory stored in neurons, not memory encoded in chemical patterns, memory that is intrinsic to awareness itself. When you become aware of something, that awareness leaves an imprint in consciousness, not just in your individual consciousness, but in the larger field of consciousness within which your individual awareness arises. Because your consciousness is not separate from universal consciousness. Your awareness is a localized expression of awareness itself. Think of a wave on the ocean. The wave has its own temporary form, its own apparent separate existence. But the wave is not separate from the ocean. The wave is the ocean, temporarily configured in a particular pattern. When the wave subsides, it does not disappear. It returns to the ocean, and the movement that created it leaves a pattern in the water. Your consciousness is like that wave, temporarily individual, apparently separate, but fundamentally continuous with the ocean of awareness from which it arises, and every experience, every thought, every moment of awareness creates patterns in that ocean, patterns that persist, patterns that can be accessed. This is what the Akashic records actually are, not a cosmic library, not a separate dimension. The informational structure of consciousness itself, containing the record of every experience that has ever occurred within awareness. And because your consciousness is not separate from this larger field, you have access. Not through traveling somewhere, not through elaborate ritual, through shifting the focus of your awareness from local to universal, from individual to collective, from personal memory to the memory of consciousness itself. The mechanism is simple, the practice is difficult. Consciousness operates at different frequencies. When you're engaged in ordinary waking awareness, thinking, planning, reacting to sensory input, you're operating at a frequency that is local, personal, confined to the processing capacity of your individual nervous system. When you sleep and dream, consciousness shifts to a different frequency. You access memories and make connections that are not available during waking state. You sometimes dream of things you have no way of knowing, things that later prove accurate. This is not magic. This is consciousness operating at a frequency where individual boundaries become more permeable. When you meditate deeply, when you drop beneath thought into the stillness that underlies mental activity, consciousness shifts again. The frequency slows, the focus broadens. The filters that normally keep awareness confined to personal experience begin to dissolve. And in that dissolution, something becomes possible that is not possible in ordinary awareness. You can know things without thinking them. You can access information without retrieving it from personal memory. You can experience awareness that is not bound by the limitations of your individual perspective. This is not theory. This is reported experience across traditions, across centuries, across cultures that had no contact with one another. The practice itself is almost absurdly simple. Sit, breathe. Let thoughts arise and pass without engaging them. Do not try to stop thinking. Do not try to make the mind blank. Simply withdraw your investment in thought. Watch it the way you would watch clouds passing across the sky. As thought loses its grip on awareness, as you stop identifying with the mental commentary that normally dominates consciousness, something else emerges. Stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of presence. The stillness that exists before thought, beneath thought, independent of thought. In that stillness, awareness opens, the bandwidth increases, the filters relax, and information begins to flow that is not coming from personal memory, not coming from sensory input, not coming from the thinking mind. At first, this feels like intuition, like hunches, like knowing something without knowing how you know it. With practice, it becomes clearer, more precise, more reliable, not because you are developing supernatural abilities, but because you are learning to stabilize awareness at frequencies where access to larger fields of information is natural. The ancient texts describe specific techniques for enhancing this access. Breath patterns that shift consciousness from sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system activity. Body postures that align energy flows and open channels of perception. Focus points that anchor awareness and prevent it from drifting back into ordinary thought patterns. But these are support mechanisms. These are not the access itself. The access comes from the shift in consciousness. The access comes from moving from thinking to knowing, from local awareness to universal awareness, from identification with the personal self to recognition of awareness itself. You would think that if this works, if this is a reliable method for accessing knowledge beyond personal experience, someone would have written a clear manual. Step 1, sit this way. Step 2, breathe like this. Step 3, focus here. Result, direct access to universal knowledge. Why does such a manual not exist? Why are all the ancient texts cryptic, paradoxical, filled with symbolism and metaphor rather than clear instruction? 3 reasons, each important, each misunderstood by modern seekers who want simple techniques they can practice without context. First, discernment. Not everyone who can access expanded states of consciousness is prepared to interpret what they access accurately. Consciousness is vast. It contains everything, including confusion, including delusion, including experiences that feel profound but are actually just interesting patterns in awareness. Without discernment, without the ability to distinguish genuine knowing from convincing imagination, access to expanded states becomes dangerous. Not because dark forces will attack you, because you will believe things that are not true. You will mistake patterns in your own consciousness for absolute truth. You will become ungrounded. The ancient mystery schools required years of preparation before teaching direct access techniques, not to keep knowledge secret, to ensure students had developed sufficient discernment to use that knowledge wisely. Second, protection. When you begin accessing information at frequencies beyond ordinary awareness, you become visible to other consciousness operating at those frequencies. Most of this is benign or irrelevant, but some of it is not. Some of it is predatory. Some of it seeks to deceive, manipulate, drain. Traditional teachings include protection practices, not against demons or evil spirits, but against consciousness that operates without compassion, without truth, without regard for your well-being. These practices are not complex, but they must be learned in context, adapted to individual circumstances, tested through experience. Third, transmission. The deepest teachings cannot be written. They can only be transmitted directly, consciousness to consciousness, in the presence of someone who has already stabilized at the frequencies you are learning to access. This is not elitism, this is mechanism. When you sit with someone whose awareness is stable in expanded consciousness, your own consciousness naturally begins to resonate at that frequency. It is like tuning forks. Strike one and nearby tuning forks begin to vibrate at the same pitch. This is why Jesus placed hands on heads. This is why meditation masters sit with students in silence. This is why mystery initiations involve direct encounter with the teacher's consciousness. Not because they were transferring something you did not have, because they were activating what was already present but dormant. You cannot get this from a book. You cannot get this from a video. You cannot get this from written instructions. You can get information from these sources. You can get techniques. You can get practices. But the transmission itself requires presence, and so the knowledge was never fully systematized. The practices were passed from teacher to student, adapted to each student's capacity, protected by the requirement of personal transmission, not to keep it from the masses, to ensure it was transmitted with integrity, with discernment, with protection. But this created a problem, because what requires personal transmission is vulnerable to persecution. Kill the teachers and the transmission stops. Destroy the schools and the knowledge is lost. Label the practice as dangerous or demonic and students stop seeking it. This is exactly what happened. And it happened systematically. And it happened for a reason. In the first 3 centuries after Jesus, Christianity was diverse. Multiple interpretations of his teaching coexisted. Multiple communities practiced different forms of worship, emphasized different aspects of his message, created different structures for spiritual practice. Some communities emphasized the historical Jesus, his death and resurrection, salvation through correct belief in his divine nature. Other communities emphasized the living Christ, the inner teacher, salvation through direct knowing and personal gnosis. Both existed. Both claimed to follow Jesus. Both had texts they considered authoritative. For 300 years, this plurality was the reality of Christianity. Then Constantine converted. Then Christianity became the state religion of Rome. Then councils were convened to determine which interpretation was correct, which texts were authoritative, which practices were acceptable. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, bishops from across the empire gathered to establish orthodoxy. They created a creed. They defined correct belief. They determined which Gospels would be included in the official canon and which would be excluded. This was not a scholarly process. This was not a careful evaluation of historical accuracy or spiritual authenticity. This was a political process. Constantine needed religious unity to consolidate imperial power. Diversity was dangerous. Plurality was threatening. One empire required one church with one doctrine. The communities that emphasized inner knowing, that taught direct access to divine consciousness, that claimed personal gnosis rather than accepting teaching on authority, these became heretical. Not because their practices were dangerous, because their existence threatened institutional control. The texts they used were burned. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Secret Book of John. Hundreds of texts describing Jesus' teaching about inner knowing, about direct access, about the kingdom within, all labelled heretical and systematically destroyed. Only fragments survived, hidden in caves, buried in desert sands, preserved by communities that went underground rather than submit to orthodoxy. What was lost? What did these texts contain that was so threatening? Instructions. Specific instructions for practices that Jesus taught his closest students. Not beliefs to accept. Not moral commands to obey. Practices for shifting consciousness, for accessing expanded awareness, for reading the record directly. In the Gospel of Philip, Jesus says, "Light and darkness, life and death, right and left, are brothers of one another. They cannot be separated. Because of this, neither are the good good, nor the evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. For this reason, each will dissolve into its original nature. But those who are exalted above the world are indissoluble, eternal." This is not metaphor. This is description of consciousness beyond duality. This is pointing to awareness that exists prior to the categories through which ordinary mind organizes experience. And when you access that awareness, when you stabilize in consciousness that is prior to duality, you can see the architecture of reality itself. You can see how the system works. You can see the mechanisms of control. And this is what made it heretical. Not the practice itself, the implications of the practice. The word witchcraft is power. The word witchcraft is control. The word witchcraft ends conversation, stops investigation, justifies persecution. When a practice is labelled witchcraft, you do not need to explain why it is wrong. You do not need to examine its effects or investigate its claims. The label itself is sufficient. Witchcraft is evil by definition. Anyone who practices it deserves punishment. This is not ancient superstition. This is sophisticated political technology. The accusation of witchcraft has been used for centuries to eliminate dissent, suppress alternative power structures, and maintain institutional authority. Who gets accused of witchcraft? Not random people. Not people who are actually dangerous. People who threaten existing power structures through possessing knowledge, skills, or authority that bypasses official channels. Women healers who know medicinal plants and can treat illness without requiring church-approved physicians. Accused of witchcraft. Mystics who claim direct communication with the divine without requiring priestly mediation. Accused of witchcraft. Communities that practice spiritual techniques outside official religious frameworks. Accused of witchcraft. People who can access knowledge through inner means, who demonstrate abilities that suggest consciousness is not confined to individual brains, who show that direct knowing is possible. Accused of witchcraft. The pattern is consistent. The accusation follows power, follows knowledge, follows anything that suggests official gatekeepers are not necessary. Gender is significant here. The overwhelming majority of people executed for witchcraft were women. Why? Because women in medieval and early modern Europe had access to forms of knowledge that bypassed male-dominated institutions. Midwifery, herbalism, healing practices passed down through generations of women. This was knowledge that existed outside university medicine, outside church authority, outside the control of official institutions, and it worked. Women healers successfully treated conditions that male physicians could not. This was intolerable to institutional authority. Not because the healing was harmful, because the healing demonstrated that official channels were not necessary. If women could heal without medical degrees, without church blessing, without institutional authorization, what else might they be able to do? The witch hunts were systematic elimination of alternative knowledge systems. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. The vast majority were women. The vast majority possessed knowledge or skills that existed outside institutional control. And what were they actually doing? What practices earned the label of witchcraft? Herbal medicine, midwifery, divination, dream interpretation, healing through touch and prayer, meditation practices, techniques for entering altered states of consciousness, methods for accessing information through inner knowing rather than external authority. In other words, they were practicing precisely what Jesus taught. Direct access, inner knowing, the kingdom within. What was actually being suppressed? Strip away the propaganda. Look beneath the accusations. Examine what actually got people killed. Autonomy, the capacity to function spiritually, intellectually, and practically without requiring permission from institutional authorities. Inner authority, the lived experience that truth can be verified directly, that knowledge can be accessed internally, that you do not need external validation to trust what you know, direct access to truth. The demonstration that consciousness is not confined to individual brains, that information exists in fields you can learn to read, that the record is accessible to anyone who develops the capacity to access it. These are not crimes, these are threats. Threats to structures that depend on controlling access to knowledge, on maintaining hierarchies of spiritual authority, on keeping populations dependent on institutional mediation. The suppression was never about protecting people from dangerous practices. The suppression was about protecting institutions from practices that made institutions unnecessary. And it worked. For centuries it worked. The knowledge went underground. The practices were hidden. The transmission became fragmented. Whole lineages were lost. Techniques that had been refined over generations were forgotten. By the time the witch hunts ended, by the time it was no longer legal to execute people for practicing unapproved spiritual techniques, the damage was done. The knowledge that consciousness can access information beyond personal experience, that inner knowing is reliable, that direct access is possible, this knowledge had been successfully erased from mainstream culture. People forgot that they could know directly. They forgot that consciousness is not confined to individual skulls. They forgot that memory extends beyond personal experience. They forgot that the kingdom is within. This forgetting was not accidental. This forgetting was the goal. Because a population that has forgotten its own capacity for direct knowing is a population that will accept authority without question, that will believe what institutions tell them to believe, that will never discover they can verify truth for themselves. They had different names in different places: the Gnostics, the Cathars, the Beguines, the mystics who wandered from town to town teaching practices their contemporaries had forgotten, the hermits in caves who could answer questions about events they had no way of witnessing, the healers who knew your history without being told. They are gone now, not because they all died, because the knowledge stopped being transmitted, because students stopped seeking teachers, because it became too dangerous to practice openly. The Cathars were exterminated in the Albigensian Crusade. An entire culture, an entire spiritual tradition, systematically destroyed by armies sanctioned by the Catholic Church. Their crime. They taught that direct connection to the divine was possible without church mediation. They taught that inner knowing was more reliable than institutional doctrine. They taught practices for accessing consciousness beyond ordinary awareness. Pope Innocent III launched the crusade in 1209. For 20 years, armies slaughtered Cathars by the thousands. At Béziers, when soldiers asked how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics, the papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Entire towns were massacred, libraries were burned, teachers were hunted down and executed. By 1229, the Cathar tradition was effectively destroyed. Fragments of their teaching survived in hidden manuscripts. The practices themselves, the actual techniques they used for entering expanded states of consciousness and accessing direct knowing, were lost. The Beguines were women's spiritual communities in medieval Europe. They took no formal vows. They belonged to no official order. They lived together, practiced meditation and contemplative prayer, supported themselves through work, and taught practices for experiencing God directly without requiring priests or sacraments. This was intolerable. The Church condemned them repeatedly. Individual Beguines were tried for heresy. Marguerite Porret, a Beguine mystic who wrote about union with the divine through inner knowing, was burned at the stake in 1310. Her book was banned. The Beguine movement was suppressed. The pattern repeats across centuries, across geographies, across traditions. Anyone teaching direct access, anyone demonstrating that inner knowing is possible, anyone showing that consciousness extends beyond individual boundaries, labelled heretical, persecuted, silenced. And with each suppression, more knowledge was lost, more techniques were forgotten, more lineages were broken. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, by the time it was no longer acceptable to execute people for religious differences, the esoteric core of Western spiritual tradition had been almost completely destroyed. What remained were exoteric shells, religions based on belief, morality, and institutional authority, with little memory that they had once taught practices for direct knowing. Watch what happened to the word salvation. In the Gnostic texts, salvation is gnosis, direct knowing, personal recognition of your true nature as consciousness itself. Salvation is what happens when you remember who you are. It is a shift in awareness, not a reward for correct behavior. In institutional Christianity, salvation became something earned through belief and obedience. You are saved if you believe the right doctrines, if you accept Christ as Saviour, if you obey church teaching, if you perform the correct rituals, if you demonstrate proper submission to religious authority. The shift is complete. Salvation is no longer about knowing. Salvation is about obeying. Why? Because knowing creates autonomy. Knowing cannot be controlled. If your salvation depends on direct experience, institutions cannot mediate it. They cannot grant it or withhold it. They cannot use it to control behavior or enforce conformity. But if salvation depends on belief, on correct doctrine, on proper adherence to institutional teaching, then institutions have power. They can determine who is saved and who is damned. They can enforce obedience by threatening damnation. They can maintain authority by positioning themselves as the only legitimate path to divine favour. This same pattern appears across traditions as they institutionalize. In Buddhism, enlightenment shifted from direct recognition of Buddha nature to complex doctrines about karma, rebirth, and gradual purification through merit-making and ritual. In Islam, direct knowing of God became suspect, and emphasis shifted to correct practice, proper interpretation of scripture, and submission to religious authority. In every case, the shift serves the same function. It replaces direct experience with mediated access. It makes spiritual progress dependent on institutional validation. It ensures that people need the institution in order to achieve the goals the tradition claims to offer. And once this shift is complete, once salvation has been replaced by obedience, the very idea of direct knowing becomes dangerous. It becomes heretical. It becomes a threat that must be suppressed. Because if people discover they can access truth directly, if they recognize that consciousness extends beyond personal boundaries, if they learn practices for reading the record themselves, they stop needing the institution. They stop obeying without question. They start verifying claims, testing doctrines, trusting their own experience over external authority. This is precisely what institutions cannot allow. And so, the suppression continued, generation after generation, until direct knowing was successfully erased from collective memory. Imagine growing up in a world where no one remembers that humans can dream. Sleep happens every night, but the experiences that occur during sleep are forgotten immediately upon waking. No one talks about dreams because no one knows dreams exist. Then one day, you remember a dream. You tell someone about it. They look at you like you're insane. You experienced what? While you were asleep? Impossible. Sleep is unconsciousness. Nothing happens during sleep. You must be making this up or hallucinating or possessed by demons. You insist it was real. You describe the vividness of the experience, the coherent narrative, the emotions you felt. They become more alarmed. This is dangerous. This is evidence of mental instability. You need help. You need to stop talking about these dreams before you influence others. This is approximately what happened with direct knowing. Humanity forgot something fundamental about consciousness, and once forgotten, anyone who remembered was treated as delusional, dangerous, or demonically influenced. We forgot that consciousness is not produced by brains. We forgot that awareness extends beyond individual nervous systems. We forgot that memory exists beyond personal experience. We forgot that information can be accessed through inner means, without physical transmission. We forgot that you can know things without being told. We forgot that the soul carries its own record. We forgot that consciousness is continuous, that what appears to die is only the body, that awareness itself persists and carries with it the patterns of every experience it has ever had. We forgot that your consciousness is not separate from universal consciousness. We forgot that when you quiet the ordinary mind and drop into stillness, you access awareness that transcends personal boundaries. We forgot that the kingdom is within. This forgetting was not natural. This was not the inevitable result of scientific progress or rational thinking. This was systematic suppression, deliberate erasure, multi-generational elimination of knowledge that threatened institutional power, and in forgetting, we became dependent on external authorities to tell us what is true, dependent on institutions to mediate our relationship with the divine, dependent on gatekeepers to grant us access to knowledge that actually exists within us already. We lost our spiritual compass. We lost the capacity to verify truth through direct experience. We lost confidence in inner knowing and learned to distrust any knowledge that comes from within rather than from approved external sources. This is the inheritance of suppression, not just lost techniques, not just forgotten practices, lost confidence in consciousness itself, lost trust in our own capacity to know. And this loss has consequences that extend far beyond spiritual practice. Because if you cannot trust inner knowing, if you have been trained to believe that only external authorities have access to truth, you are vulnerable. Vulnerable to manipulation, vulnerable to deception, vulnerable to accepting claims that contradict direct experience because you have learned not to trust direct experience. The antidote is remembering, not learning something new, remembering what was forgotten, reclaiming capacities that were suppressed but never actually lost, rediscovering that consciousness is vast, that knowledge is accessible, that the kingdom is within. History is not linear. History spirals. What is suppressed in one era returns in another, often in forms so different that the continuity is not immediately obvious. The knowledge did not die. It could not die. Because it is not information that can be destroyed by burning books or executing teachers. It is capacity intrinsic to consciousness itself, and consciousness persists. What happened instead is that the knowledge went underground. It fragmented, it dispersed, it adapted to new contexts, new languages, new cultural frameworks. It survived in poetry, in symbolism, in practices that looked innocuous but preserved the essential technology. The Kabbalists in medieval Spain encoded techniques for expanded consciousness in complex symbolic systems that looked like abstract philosophy. The Sufis in Islamic lands taught practices for direct knowing disguised as poetry and dance. The alchemists in Europe described consciousness transformation in the language of chemical processes, hiding spiritual technology inside metaphors about transmuting lead into gold. To external observers, to the authorities who might suppress them, these looked like intellectual exercises, artistic expressions, primitive chemistry. To students who knew how to read the symbolism, they were instruction manuals for accessing consciousness beyond ordinary awareness. This is how knowledge survives suppression, not through direct preservation, through encoding, through adaptation, through transmission that looks like something harmless, while carrying the essential teaching in forms that only those who are ready can recognize, and periodically, the knowledge resurfaces. Not because it was rediscovered, but because conditions shift and it becomes possible to teach more openly again. In the Renaissance, when the Church's power began to weaken and intellectual inquiry became more possible, ancient texts started circulating again. Platonic and Hermetic writings that described consciousness as primary, that taught direct knowing, that pointed toward awareness beyond individual boundaries. In the 19th century, as scientific materialism seemed to close the door on spiritual experience, new movements arose teaching meditation, exploring consciousness, translating Eastern texts that preserved techniques Western traditions had suppressed. In the 1960s, as another generation rejected institutional authority and sought direct experience, interest in meditation, mysticism, and expanded states of consciousness exploded. Not because these were new, because conditions made it possible to speak about them openly again. Each time, the knowledge returns in forms appropriate to the culture. Each time, new language is used to describe experiences that are actually ancient and consistent across traditions. Each time, people discover that consciousness is not what they were taught, that awareness extends beyond personal boundaries, that direct knowing is possible. And each time, after initial enthusiasm, comes reaction, skepticism, dismissal, ridicule, attempts to explain away experiences that do not fit materialist frameworks, warnings about delusion, about gullibility, about dangerous practices that lead to mental instability. The suppression is softer now. You do not get burned at the stake for practicing meditation, but you may be dismissed as irrational, as unscientific, as indulging in wishful thinking or primitive superstition. The pattern remains. Knowledge of consciousness beyond ordinary awareness threatens established frameworks. Those who claim direct knowing are marginalized, and yet the knowledge persists because it is not belief or theory. It is capacity. And capacities that are real cannot be permanently suppressed. Something is happening now that has not happened for centuries. Direct knowing is being reported by people who have no connection to spiritual traditions, no training in esoteric practices, no framework for understanding what they're experiencing, near-death experiences, spontaneous past life memories in children, accurate precognition, remote viewing, moments of suddenly knowing something about a person you have never met, dreams that prove prophetic, meditation experiences where boundaries dissolve and awareness expands into something vast and universal. This is not increasing because more people are making it up. The experiences are being reported more frequently because more people are willing to speak about experiences they would have previously hidden for fear of being dismissed as crazy. Social media has created new contexts for sharing. Online communities allow people to find others who have had similar experiences. The shame and isolation that once kept people silent about anomalous experiences is dissolving. And what is emerging is a consistent pattern. Different people, different backgrounds, different cultures, no connection to one another, describing the same thing. Consciousness beyond brain, access to information beyond personal memory, knowing without thinking, direct perception of truth. This is not religion. This is not belief system. This is people describing what they have directly experienced. And the consistency across reports suggests they are describing something real, something that exists independent of cultural interpretation or spiritual framework. Scientists are beginning to pay attention. Research on meditation shows measurable changes in brain activity. Studies on near-death experiences document consistent features across thousands of cases. Investigation of children who report past life memories finds details that check out that the child has no normal way of knowing. The materialist framework, consciousness is produced by brains, nothing exists beyond physical matter, direct knowing is impossible, is encountering increasing evidence that consciousness is not what we have been taught. This does not mean all claims of direct knowing are accurate. This does not mean every spiritual experience is genuine contact with expanded awareness. Discernment remains essential. Distinguishing actual knowing from convincing imagination remains necessary. But something is shifting. The absolute dismissal of direct knowing is becoming harder to maintain. The evidence is accumulating. The reports are too consistent, too detailed, too verifiable through independent investigation. And people are remembering, not just intellectually, experientially, practicing meditation and discovering that consciousness expands beyond personal boundaries, sitting in stillness and accessing information they have no way of knowing through ordinary means, testing their inner knowing and finding it accurate, reliable, trustworthy. This is the return, not because new knowledge is being revealed, because old knowledge is being remembered, because capacities that were always present are being rediscovered, because the suppression is weakening and consciousness is reclaiming its own nature. What Jesus taught was not belief. What he taught was not moral system or spiritual philosophy or doctrinal framework. What he taught was practice. Specific, concrete practices for shifting consciousness from identification with personal self to recognition of universal awareness. These practices do not require religious context. They do not require accepting Christian doctrine or any other theological framework. They work because they engage consciousness directly, because they utilize capacities intrinsic to awareness itself. The Akashic records, the memory of consciousness, the informational structure of awareness are not separate from you. They are not something you need special permission to access. They are the nature of consciousness itself. And your consciousness is not separate from universal consciousness. This is not metaphor. This is description of what is actually true. When you quiet ordinary mental activity, when you drop beneath thought into the stillness that underlies awareness, you discover that consciousness is vast. You discover that boundaries you thought were absolute are actually permeable. You discover that you can know things you have no business knowing through ordinary means. This is why it was suppressed. Not because it is false, because it is true. And if true, if verifiable through direct experience, it changes everything. You do not need priests. You do not need institutional mediation. You do not need anyone to grant you permission to access truth. You need the practice. You need to learn how consciousness actually works. You need to develop the discernment to distinguish real knowing from imagination. You need to cultivate the stillness in which direct access becomes possible. And when you do this, when you practice consistently, when you learn to stabilize awareness in expanded consciousness, you discover that the record is readable. Not through traveling to some distant cosmic library, not through elaborate ritual or secret techniques, through recognizing that consciousness itself is the record. Every thought that has ever occurred has left its imprint in awareness. Every action has created patterns in the field of consciousness. Every experience exists still, not in past, but in the eternal present, where all moments are simultaneously accessible to awareness operating at the right frequency. You can learn to read this, not through being chosen, not through being special, through becoming still enough, focused enough, clear enough that your awareness can extend beyond personal boundaries and touch the larger field from which it arises. This is what Jesus taught. This is what was labelled witchcraft. This is what was suppressed for centuries, and this is what is returning now. Not because someone is revealing hidden secrets, because people are practicing, discovering for themselves, verifying through direct experience that consciousness is not confined, that knowing is possible, that the kingdom is within. The record is opening. Not because you are opening it, because it was never closed. Only your awareness of it was closed. Only your access was forgotten, and now you remember. Not because someone told you, because something inside recognized truth when it heard it. Because consciousness, when pointed toward itself, naturally recognizes its own nature. This is not the end of the teaching. This is the beginning, because the real teaching is not in these words. The real teaching is in the practice, in the stillness, in the direct encounter with consciousness itself. Jesus did not give answers. He gave practice. He taught people how to access truth directly rather than accepting it on authority. He showed that the book of life is not sealed. He demonstrated that reading it is not forbidden. He opened a path that anyone can walk. The choice is yours. Accept teaching on authority or verify it through direct experience. Believe what institutions tell you or discover what consciousness reveals when given the space to reveal itself. Remain dependent on external validation or reclaim your own capacity for inner knowing. The kingdom is within you. The record is accessible. The teaching is available. Not hidden, not forbidden, only forgotten. And forgetting can be undone through practice, through stillness, through allowing consciousness to remember its own nature. This is the final teaching. Everything you seek already exists within you. Not metaphorically, actually. The question is not whether you can access it. The question is whether you will.